Today, I am going to try and answer the #1 question on everyone's mind. Yes, everyone's, including yours. When are we finally going to see Spyro 4 announced and released? Let's talk about it. Before I begin this video, this is not going to be a firm date on when we're going to see the next Spyro title. What I'm going to be doing is doing a boatload of research about what happened before with marketing patterns and development time and everything in between, what's happening now, and then we're going to guesstimate and put a range on when we will see it. There's not going to be firm dates, but we're going to be able to get a gist of where we believe it's going to be announced. These are researched and educated guesses. These are, of course, not official. But with that said, a lot of work has been put into this video to get as close as we can to the range of when we're going to finally see the next entry to Spyro. So, in order to answer this question of when are we finally going to see Spyro 4, it all comes down to two things: scheduling and timing. What we have to figure out is A, when did Spyro start development? B, how long is it going to take to make? And C, is there a window of release for marketing purposes? Let's get started by solving this equation by actually starting with the letter B. How long could it take to develop Spyro 4? There's two ways to look at this. It all depends on the studio and the scale of the game. If Toys for Bob wants to make a World of Warcraft level Spyro game, yeah, it's gonna take a bajillion years. But let's set the scale of the game to something similar to Crash Bandicoot 4, or maybe Spyro Reignited 1 and 2 combined. So now that we kind of have a scale to work with, let's take a look at Toys for Bob's past history when it came to game development times, starting with Skylanders. Toys for Bob's development between each game was approximately 2 years, give or take. TFB would alternate leadership with Vicarious Visions for each game. However, in 2017, Toys for Bob would then release Skylanders Imaginators, and this would be the final Skylanders that they would deal with. Then, Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy would release via Vicarious Visions 3 months later. Now, here comes the question that we all want to know. How long did it take to develop Spyro Reignited? Well, if Imaginators came out in March 2017 and Reignited came out in Q4 of 2018, that's not a lot of time, to be honest. But we can actually hone in even more on the time span if we dig a little bit deeper and know where to look. And lucky for me, I do know where to look. According to many members of Toys for Bob, Toasty was the very first level that was worked on. It was small and a good vertical slice for Toys for Bob to really establish the game's core mechanics. But why is this important? Well, according to a leaked document from a UI designer, we can see that for Spyro Reignited's scheduled milestones, Toasty was meant to be complete by December 18th, 2017. Now, according to past rumors, before Spyro was delayed, the original development time was about 11 months, 13 if you include the delay from September to November, which would mean that Spyro Reignited started full-scale development around October 2017, and this kind of corroborates with the date that we have set for Toasty. Additionally, Toys for Bob was largely responsible for the development of Spyro 1 and Spyro 2 Reignited, while Sanzaru was taking the most of the lead on Spyro 3. Finishing the Spyro trilogy in just over a year is a tall task, especially since that this was also Toys for Bob's first game in the Unreal Engine. So there was definitely a learning curve for them. But also, this was their first remaster and first time leading a non-Skylanders game in a very, very long time. Then, when it came to Crash Bandicoot 4, the project briefly started in 2017, but had a large pause for Spyro Reignited's development, and then resumed after Spyro's launch. With Crash Bandicoot 4 coming out in late 2020, the development time was, again, around 2 years. So our knee-jerk reaction may be to simply think, hey, Toys for Bob will take around 2 years to make the next Spyro title. Well, Yeah, that is 100% possible. But let's hold our horses for a second because there is some nuances that we have to calculate for. While Toys for Bob could probably crank out Spyro 4 in just 2 years of development, there's a few things we have to think of. The first is that Toys for Bob is not as big as they were before. At one point, they had close to 100 people in studio when they were owned by Activision. Now, they're more closer to 40. Also, Toys for Bob had help from other Activision studios, like Beanox, Vicarious Visions, and even unlikely sources, like Sledgehammer. Now, they don't have access to these companies. Of course, Toys for Bob can still hire third-party and perhaps get some help from Xbox's studios, but overall, the optics make it look like it's a much smaller team than when they were working on Spyro Reignited. However, Toys for Bob also worked on Activision projects like Call of Duty and even Destiny, but now they don't need to do that anymore because they have only one project that they are working on and they are seemingly more unified and focused. While 2 years is still possible, I'm gonna put a range of 2 to 3 years for this equation, especially since this is going to be their first game as an indie studio. The next question we have to ask is, when did they start development? Well, this section is going to be much shorter than the previous section because last year I released a report stating that Spyro 4 had just gone into fresh development, starting in approximately December 2023 or January 2024, give or take a month. I'm not going to rehash the whole video, but if you need just one bit of evidence to gauge timing, we can see here that at one of the heads of Toys for Bob over on their LinkedIn profile, it shows that there was a project that they had started development in December 2023. And again, in that video, I reiterate that project is Spyro 4. So, are we ready to predict when we'll see the next Spyro? Well, slow down on the brakes because there's one more factor to this equation, and that is C, release windows. Certain companies like releasing games during specific times, whether it's to capitalize on the Christmas season, summer break, or to be a AAA standout during a typically dead period. Each company has their own strategy and thought process for when a game should launch for them that's most beneficial for the game. Sometimes this can give developers actually a few extra months to smooth out their game to be able to kind of hit that specific time zone. Other times, it might force them to have to pick up the pace to meet a release window that's a little bit earlier than they may be comfortable with. Activision has an established pattern for marketing their games. This has been something that we have been able to track for many years. From release windows, advertising time, hype leading up to announcements, and more. Now, for the purpose of this video, I made this chart showing off all 4 of Activision's release windows. But you only need to focus on 3 because the 4th is literally just the mainline Call of Duty games. But since 2017, Activision has 3 other release windows. As in, since 2017, every game that they have released has fallen within these windows. Basically, if Activision is going to be releasing a game, that means that they will be launching during these very specific timed windows. The first category is what I like to call Sometimes March. Such a great name, right? Games released during this time are either smaller scopes games like remasters, ports, mobile games, or games that Activision didn't actually develop but are publishing. Again, it's called Sometimes March because, well, it's not something that they are quite consistent with, but March is typically not where they would drop a quote-unquote big game from one of their companies. The next category is the summer drop. These games are released in June or July. For a while, this was the Crash Bandicoot spot. The next is the fall release. These games are typically released between September and October and are always at least 1 month before Call of Duty's launch. The other detail is that Activision doesn't typically do coming soon on their trailers. When they drop a trailer, it typically already has a release date locked in. That release date is also never in the too far and distant future. The longest I've seen was about 7 months. The shortest was 4 months. So, give or take, Activision advertises their game actively for about 6 months, give or take a month. So with Toys for Bob starting development in January 2024, taking approximately 2 to 3 years to develop a game, and with these release windows and advertising in mind, we should be able to figure out when we'll see Spyro, right? Yes! But before we do that, there is a bit of an interesting wrinkle. See, because Activision is no longer independently owned, but is now owned by Microsoft Xbox. And because of that, Spyro may not be following Activision's exact release windows or patterns. Xbox has a much less established pattern. Over the years, Xbox has also been known for announcing games way too early. Fable, Perfect Dark, Everwild, Elder Scrolls, the list goes on and on. However, recently I've noticed a small pattern pop up in recent projects for Xbox. To spare you the long explanation and the long chart that I drafted, Xbox essentially reveals the game a year and a half before its internal slated release. Then, about a year later, drops the next big trailer with a release date. And then the marketing cranks up from there for the remaining time. Again, this is not a locked-in pattern like Activision's. This is more of a recent trend. But because we're not sure how Spyro will be handled, whether it's Xbox's YOLO marketing or Activision's strict by-the-numbers method, I will create two equations. The first will be if Spyro is being handled like classic Activision, and the second will be if it's being handled by Xbox. Now, of course, these predictions are based on the fact that there are no game development car crashes along the way, meaning the game's overall development is relatively smooth as chunky peanut butter. I say that because game development is never smooth and typically is a constant disaster, or as Lou Studdard said, a whirling dervish of chaos that kind of settles close to the end. But take these predictions with the nuance that nothing blows up in a catastrophic fashion. For the Activision equation, technically speaking, Spyro could be announced in 3 distinct time periods. And for Xbox, there are technically 2 periods. One is very unlikely though. So let's break these possibilities down. Starting with Activision, the first one is seeing Spyro launch in fall 2025. And when I mean launch, I don't mean revealed. I mean you are playing the game in fall 2025 this year. But this prediction seems short on notice, if you catch my drift. See, this would only mean that the game would have had only 22 months of development. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Toys for Bob is a smaller studio now. So while this is not impossible, it's definitely a tight squeeze. I also wouldn't want Toys for Bob to crunch that hard to get this game out. However, if that were to be the case, that Spyro would be released in fall 2025 this year, Spyro would be revealed, likely, during the Summer Game Fest of 2025 or PAX East 2025, because that is where Spyro Reignited was originally announced. The second prediction is Spyro releasing in June 2026. Again, game in hand, summer 2026. That would definitely give Toys for Bob an adequate amount of time for development, which would amount to 2.5 years in total. Also, this would place Spyro's announcement at around Game Awards 2025 this year, which we know Activision has made frequent announcements there in the past. But also, make note, Xbox does have a showcase for their upcoming games in January, like literally a month after the Game Awards. So it's possible it could show up there and not the Game Awards. But like I said, give or take a month. The third is Spyro releasing in September 2026. At this point, one or two things happened. Either development was very rocky, or the game scale is much bigger than we had initially thought. Because at this point, the game's development time would be just shy of 3 years. To give you an idea, the longest Toys for Bob has gone between the release of games is 2.5 years. And that was between Crash Bandicoot 4 and Crash Team Rumble. However, Spyro is more familiar with the September spot, as that was when Reignited had initially been slated to be released and when his ports have came out. And this is their first title as a remote indie studio. So overall, this prediction is still possible. The game would also likely be revealed at Summer Game Fest 2026 or potentially PAX East 2026. Now to the ambiguous, ever confusing Xbox marketing. If you follow Xbox recent trends and announcements that I spoke about earlier. Once we hit April 2025, under the Xbox marketing, like I just said, technically, we could hear about Spyro at any point in time. It doesn't have to be tied to a show. It can simply drop anywhere, because again, Xbox's marketing is pretty squirrely that way. Now, while Activision has 3 pretty defined chunks in terms of marketing and release, Xbox does have one that I think is most likely, but it's not as defined. But I'm going to try to define it nonetheless. This prediction is a reveal trailer at Summer Game Fest 2025, release date trailer around Summer Game Fest 2026, with a release in fall 2026. Again, this is based on Xbox's recent trends, and this could change at the drop of a hat. But if things maintain, I see this being the most likely in the Xbox category. There is also a situation where we could get the announcement at the Game Awards 2025, reveal date at Game Awards 2026, with a release in summer 2027. But that is so unlikely in my opinion. Now, in the case that Xbox decides to go off-road with their marketing patterns, as they typically do, or maybe they decide to collaborate with Activision to try and split the types of marketing right down the middle. Here is a hybrid wild card that I just wanted to throw in here for the sake of fun. Reveal at Game Awards 2025, date announcement at Summer Game Fest 2026, and launching in fall 2026. Now, I took these predictions and put them in order of what I think is most likely to unlikely. I tied Xbox's most clear option with Activision's second prediction because I think it could go either way and they both make sense. The big takeaway here, though, is that I don't think we're going to leave 2025 without hearing official word about Spyro, and most likely we'll be playing the game in fall 2026, even if we leave 2025 without hearing about it. And again, bearing in mind that nothing disastrous happens in development, and the game's scale isn't gigantic in comparison to previous Spyro and Crash projects. Speaking of Crash projects, did you know Activision made a fake Crash Bandicoot mobile game? And no, I don't mean fake Crash, I mean a fake game. If you want to hear about Crash Bandicoot Brawl, you can check out this video right here.